Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. We're located at 4700 Grover Avenue. Our programs are free and open to the public and occur most Sundays at noon. We encourage you to attend. For more information on our programs, you can go to our church website at www.austinuu.org and then click on Public Affairs Forum. There are also some videos of our forums on YouTube, and there's a link to those. And now I want to introduce today's speaker. We're very excited to have Chris Tomlinson. Chris is going to be talking about his book, Tomlinson Hill. And basically, it's a story of his family. They were slaveholders during the antebellum years. And he decided he wanted to investigate his family's past and also track down some of the descendants of the black population that had been associated with the family plantation. He's interested in issues of racial justice and reconciliation, and he will talk about his journey doing all of that. He has a very distinguished career also with the Associated Press. He was chief of the African Bureau for a number of years. His book is now a New York Times bestseller, and of course we'll probably all rush to get a copy of his book after his presentation. I know I will. Welcome, Chris.
Well, my new employer, the Houston Chronicle, would be upset if I didn't make a plug for them. After writing the book, I became a columnist because I have discovered that I liked having an opinion after 22 years of not having one. My ancestors were slaveholders, and I now understand that there was no such thing as good slaveholders. For many people who trace their heritage to the antebellum South, that statement is apostasy. For over 150 years, proud descendants of Confederate heroes have proclaimed that people with black skin were better off under slavery. The Yankees misunderstood the true nature of the peculiar institution. When I was a child, my grandfather would say to me, "Our family owned slaves, and they loved us so much they took Tomlinson as their name." In my early teens, I still believed this Southern propaganda. I watched Gone with the Wind and imagined that I was descended from aristocracy. I drank in the myth of chivalry and honor associated with the South and the lost cause. And I wondered what had happened to the black Tomlinsons. I was growing up in Dallas. My family, my grandfather, had left Tomlinson Hill with the second flood of 1900 of the Brazos River, about 20 miles southeast of Waco. It wiped out all of his crops, and there just wasn't enough money to plant another bunch. So he sold what was left of his land to his older brother, Augustus. That's when he decided to take his degree from Texas A&M and make it in the big city. So he moved to Dallas and became a civil engineer. Now, Dallas in 1920 meant that if you wanted to get ahead, you had to join the Ku Klux Klan, and he did. After all, his grandfather was a member of the Klan, and his great-grandfather and his older brothers, and his uncles, had engaged in systematic lynching in Falls County in the late 1900s. But I didn't know that then. I just thought about these black Tomlinsons. And did they move to the city? Did they still live on Tomlinson Hill? Were they still picking cotton? For the 8-year-old in me at the time, and I was fascinated by this, that was the genesis of Tomlinson Hill, the remarkable story of two families who share the Tomlinson name, one white, one black. Race was a big deal when I was growing up in Dallas. The school district had spent almost 20 years dragging its feet in desegregating the public schools. A federal judge finally ordered busing when I was entering the 5th grade. I went from attending an all-white school to one that was almost half African American. The school teachers tried to explain what was happening by making us learn Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, and one line struck a special chord for me. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I was reminded again of my heritage, and I felt a responsibility to try to bridge the racial divide, even as a child. But while my teachers told us that slavery and prejudice were wrong, they made a special point of never holding anyone responsible, especially our ancestors. That's how I ended up bragging about my family history to my friends in high school, both black and white. I'd like to read briefly from my book. My mother finalized the divorce on June 19, 1980, their 19th wedding anniversary. My mother moved us into an apartment in a new neighborhood, but since Skyline High School was a magnet school, I had friends all over the city. I spent time in South Dallas with Jackie Donahue and Vernon Wesley, whose mother owned a beauty parlor in X-Line, a black neighborhood in South Dallas. One afternoon, I sat in the salon, looking completely out of place as a blonde, blue-eyed teen, and watched with fascination as the women used hot flat irons to straighten their hair. Wesley's mom laughed and said, "You've never seen anything like this before, have you?" "No, ma'am, I haven't," I admitted. "Well, let me tell you about a black woman's hair," she began, and I've never forgotten the lesson. I dated both black and white girls, though at the time no couple in our group stuck together very long. We knew that interracial dating was taboo for many Texans, but no one made a big deal out of it at Skyline. Jackie's father, after all, was white, and they lived in an African-American neighborhood. On one weekend trip, though, we were members of the German Club, and we would travel to small towns in central Texas for their Oktoberfest, and we would dance German folk dances. On one of these trips, a German club chaperone tried to convince us that dark skin was the mark of Cain and discouraged our interracial dating. We ignored her, but my father made me angry when I showed him a picture of a black girl named Vanessa, whom I had a crush on. He looked at the photo and said, "Oh, you like dark meat." Bob liked to say provocative things to get a rise out of people, but I considered this a betrayal. He threatened to spank me if I had said anything racist, and here he was making a vulgar comment. I'd always admired him for supporting civil rights and teaching me about race and bigotry, but at that moment I realized that some liberal whites still retained the right to make an off-color joke. In the parts of Dallas where we spent most of our time, no one gave our multiracial group a second look. But we did discuss race and how we could get into trouble on the road if we were not careful. The old German settlements in central Texas held beer festivals from September through November, and we made 4 to 5 hour drives in borrowed church vans almost every weekend. Our chaperones were careful about where we stopped for bathroom breaks because some of the truck stops didn't like white teenagers with long hair, let alone African Americans. I remember escorting my black friends into a couple of places and feeling the heat on the back of my neck from rednecks staring at us. That was probably the first time I'd felt how intimidating and frightening a nasty glare could feel. Those experiences, along with dancing and drinking the weekends away, pulled us into a tight clique. On the long drives, we shared stories, and I told my friends about my family's supposedly glorious history. I impressed my white friends, but if I offended my black ones, they never said anything. It never occurred to me that they would find it upsetting. We often joked how my ancestors must have been rolling in their graves because their worst nightmares had come to pass. I thought of everyone in the group as equal, but I was acutely aware that my family, which was just scraping by, was still better off than the families of most of my African American friends. When I worked after school, I spent the money on going out. When they worked, most of the money went to their families. I also learned that Wesley and Jackie suffered from chronic health problems which were exacerbated by a lack of health insurance or regular doctor visits. And while my parents fought and my sister cried, my friends dealt with family members who committed real violence and ended up in jail. We attended the same classes at the same school, and we spent a lot of time doing the same things, but that facade masked the differences that would influence our futures. None of us made very good grades. We were too caught up in the melodrama of adolescence. I believed that our little group proved that people from different backgrounds could love one another. Years later, though, Jackie and I talked about the round-robin dating in high school, and she told me that she and Vanessa figured that the white guys would always end up with white girls and never consider a serious relationship with them. When she told me that, my heart broke a little. I realized that I'd seen our group through rose-colored glasses, and that there was so much I didn't see because I was white. My privilege allowed me a blindness to the realities that my African-American friends faced every waking minute. I thought I was progressive. They thought I was dabbling. A few years later, I joined the U.S. Army and developed a better understanding of our nation's history. I traveled the world first as a soldier and then later as a foreign correspondent. One of my first jobs was covering the end of apartheid in South Africa. That's where I visited plantations like the one my family owned and actually saw what resembled slave quarters, only to drink afternoon tea on the veranda of the landowner's mansion. I listened to white South Africans explain the necessity of apartheid, and they invoked all of the same excuses we've used in this country for oppression and prejudice and inequality. The blacks were culturally inferior, they said. Equality would endanger the economy. Blacks would only vote for demagogues and force the whites to flee. Black rule would only bring chaos. I felt as if my ancestors were speaking from the grave. After South Africa, I covered post-genocide Rwanda. I witnessed ethnic cleansing in Congo. I visited villages in Uganda savaged by the Lord's Resistance Army. In later years, I covered clan fighting in Somalia and reported from the front lines in Afghanistan and Iraq. Reporting on those conflicts, all of them driven by some form of bigotry, my desire to confront my own family's crimes grew. I'd always examined the violence of other countries with steely eyes and a cold heart. I didn't tolerate excuses for rape and murder from others. Why would I tolerate excuses from my own people? In 2007, I returned to Texas and worked on Tomlinson Hill for 5 years, mostly part-time. A friend and I produced a documentary film about how the descendants of Tomlinson Hill still struggle with the legacy of slavery in the small town of Marlin, Texas, which is about an hour and 15 minutes from here. In the early days of researching my book and thinking about the film, I went to Corsicana, Texas, where the city park is filled with examples of historic architecture. There were early dog-run log cabins like my ancestors had built for themselves when they first arrived in Texas. And there was one of the last of the 2 remaining examples of slave quarters still in Texas. Real slave quarters were tiny and with few luxuries, but this one was clearly a 5-star accommodation with a small wood stove inside of it, something I'd never even heard of in the history books I'd read. Nevertheless, I asked the white woman in the front office if I could possibly film inside the structure, because they had locked it up with a plexiglass door and we would need to open it to film. And her response sent a shiver down my spine. She said it depended on whether my film would rile up the black people. The director of the film, Lisa Koselleck, decided not to make a historical documentary and focused instead on the modern day. And that would complement the book, which covers 160 years of history for these 2 families, black and white, told in parallel. But in all of my research, never did I find such honesty about how we think about our ancestors and how we protect our myths about America. Sustaining ignorance, though, does not suppress African American frustration with our society today. One look at the protests in Ferguson or New York reveal how divided our nation remains about race and our so-called common history, or our common sense of history. Those conflicts are not really about police or crime. They are about 2 communities with fundamentally different views about the history of our nation and how far we've come and how far we have left to go. Thousands of white Americans have told me over the years that discrimination no longer exists in our country. The 13th Amendment and the Civil Rights laws of the 1960s have solved all of those problems. But that is just another myth, as powerful, convenient, and destructive as the myth of the good slave owner. The only people who benefit from maintaining these myths about our heritage are Anglo-Americans who are given plausible deniability for their inherited privilege. For African Americans, it is the theft of their history and a denial of their experience. As I make clear in Tomlinson Hill, instead of learning about the torture and murder my ancestors perpetrated on slaves and sharecroppers in order to maintain power, I was taught that while some mistakes were made, my ancestors were pioneers and pillars of the community who made this country great. African Americans were our happy helpers, whose mistreatment we no longer have to discuss because we corrected all of those things. In some ways, this is only natural. Every culture teaches us not to speak ill of the dead. What's done is done. And it's hard to imagine that the sweet-faced old people in the sepia-toned photographs could have considered people of other races as inferior species, creatures who were subhuman and not deserving of justice or equality. We also have the uniquely American conceit that we were all self-made, that classism doesn't exist in our society, that status, wealth, and education is not inherited. Some take this a step further and demand that if those born without means cannot pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, as if in some Horatio Alger story, then that person deserves their poverty and suffering. As an American who was born the year after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, I came of age during desegregation, affirmative action, and equal opportunity. But progressives still don't teach where racism comes from or the keys to defeating it. My understanding that racism was only one facet of the more fundamental problem of bigotry only became clear when I traveled abroad and learned how every society and every culture has bigotry and discrimination. In places like Rwanda, I saw where bigotry led to genocide. In Iraq, I saw sectarianism lead to crimes against humanity. In recent years, we have learned from analyzing the human genome that the chromosomes that determine our physical appearance are only a small percentage of what makes us human. So small, in fact, that an African American and I could share more DNA in common than me and another white man. Not to mention, all of us are a mix of DNA fragments that trace back to Africa and Europe, no matter the color of our skin. There has also been a lot of research on bigotry and its biological origin. And we know that it comes from the part of our brain called the amygdala, one of the most primitive parts of our brain. It's a part of the fight or flight mechanism. So just as when you feel real fear and you have that desire to fight or flee, a person who is steeped in racism is experiencing that same emotion. It is as real to them as if a saber-toothed tiger walked in today and started eating us. That's really how primitive that feeling is. And when they put racists from Alabama in a functional MRI machine and they scanned their brain while showing them images of white people and black people and brown people, they could see the spark in the amygdala when the image of someone that they were taught to hate popped up. And I think that's important because I have a lot of people. I just gave a talk 2 days ago where a woman came up to me afterward and said, I'm from the North. I don't understand the racism of I've got some dear friends who are doctors, and they are so profoundly racist. I don't understand. It's so irrational. And I'm like, yes, it's not rational. It's coming from the lizard part of their brain. It's not coming from the neocortex. It's a deep programming. And we know that it's not skin color that triggers this. When these same researchers went to England, they took soccer hooligans, the people who basically riot outside of soccer games, and they put them in the fMRI machine. And they showed them images of other white people who were wearing different soccer jerseys, football jerseys. And they found that when they showed an image of someone wearing a jersey from the team they hated most, they got the exact same reaction in the amygdala as that Alabama racist to seeing a black face. So we know that the sensation that these people feel is biological and real. It's not reasonable. But we also know that you have to be taught who to hate. You have to be taught who to fear. And that teaching doesn't necessarily have to come from your parents. It can also come from the larger society. It can come from friends on the schoolyard. But it must be taught. And that's what makes the end of my book and the end of my research so hopeful, is because after a generation of desegregation, we now have ways of testing people for racism in very subtle ways that people don't quite understand what they're being tested for. And today's generation is the least racist ever recorded. And we trace that to the same principle that these researchers used to teach these Alabama racists not to be racist anymore. And it involved creating a shared mission and a shared task. So with the Alabama racists, they put one at a time into a group of black men, the people they hated the most. And they said, here's a task. We want you to build this log cabin. But we're not going to give you any tools. You're going to have to work together as a team. And you've got 3 days to do it. And at the end of those 3 days, when that log cabin was successfully built through a lot of hard work, a lot of blood, a lot of sore muscles, a lot of pain and misery, they put the Alabama racists back in the fMRI machine, put them through the test again, and the amygdala reaction was gone. And this is called something called the in-group model. That when groups of people come together for a common goal, and they accomplish that common goal, they form an in-group. And that group becomes your tribe. It becomes your clan. It becomes, your society. And you don't hate each other anymore. And after I had read about this story, I went and met the most famous Tomlinson of all, LaDainian Tomlinson, a running back for the San Diego Chargers. He's retired now, but his great-great-grandfather was the property of my great-great-grandfather. Now, he is 15 years younger than I am, so he grew up in desegregated schools in Waco. And when we were talking, and I was interviewing him about his experiences, he discussed how he and his fellow football players never had racism as a problem. That he felt that he and the white players and the Mexican players and his other black players at University High in Waco, they were bonded by that common team building, by that common experience of going onto the football field and winning or losing together. And that's why scientists tell us we have the least racist generation ever recorded in the United States, is because of desegregated schools. Because our kids go into school with other kids of all different colors, and they form these bonds, and they come together, and they think of each other as one group, as one in-group. And that's also why these same scientists who study this are now so worried about the future of racism in America, is because schools are resegregating. And there's a real fear that we're going to lose. And that's why it's so important to think about our policies today. So when the Texas State School Board decides to start rewriting the history books so that we no longer talk about the slave trade, but we talk about the triangle trade, when we start taking black leaders out of the history books and replace them with white ones, when we allow schools to resegregate, we are basically going backwards. We're taking away that sense of what is the in-group. What is it to be American? What is it to be part of the same community? We also have to be careful, because when we want to forget the things the ugly parts of our history, we end up with a young woman named Lauren, who I know, who was, at the time, she was at the University of Texas learning to be a school teacher. And by some twist of fate, we were sharing a Thanksgiving dinner one year. And she started talking about how, it must be black people's fault that they don't have the same jobs and the same economic opportunity, and why do they have such worse health statistics? And she just didn't get it because she'd never been taught really fully about the civil rights movement. She wasn't a hateful person. She'd gone to desegregated schools. But when she sat down and she compared, here's black unemployment to white unemployment, here's black health to white health, here's the difference in educational achievements, she was like, there must be something wrong with them because no one ever taught me about the history of race in America. And 2 years later, after she read my book, she sent me this, probably the best email I've received so far. And she said, I didn't know. I didn't learn this in school. I'm so thankful. I get it now. I get the fact that my father, Bob Tomlinson, went to elementary school in 1950, where in the 4th grade he could study violin and German in a 10-year-old building built by the WPA, in the best part of Dallas, Texas. And that Ladanian's father, Oliver Terry Tomlinson, OT, to go with LT, OT went to school in a sharecropper shack on Tomlinson Hill with no running water, no toilets, no electricity. He only went to school half the time that my father did because he was needed in the fields to cut and pick cotton. And there was no German. There were no violins. That's not that long ago. People always tell me, why are you dragging this up? It's all such ancient history. Well, I interviewed O.T.'s sister, who remembered her grandfather, who was born into slavery. And she remembers Peter telling her about the slave days. So I know someone who knows someone who was held in slavery. It's not that long ago when you think about how these things are passed down. And it also, failing to know our history, leads to Ferguson and Staten Island. It leads to white police officers who don't understand why the African American community doesn't trust them. It leads to those white police officers coming to the assumption that there's something wrong with that community if they don't trust me, because in my heart I'm not racist and I'm a good cop and I'm going to do my job properly. So anyone who doesn't trust me, they must be bad in some way. I saw this over and over again in Iraq, where a new group of troops would come in, and I spent over 2 years in Iraq, and they'd say, I'm an American soldier. I'm a hero. I'm a good person. I'm trying to do something good for this country. Why doesn't anybody trust me? Why doesn't anyone cooperate with me? It's because they don't take a step back and think, what is their history? What is their experience? Why can't, they don't take the time to see things in that way. So it's not enough just it's not enough to not be racist. And it reminds me of a Buddhist parable where a monk goes up to the cistern to gather some water, and he sees an ant. And the first monk kills the ant for trying to get some water. He says, I don't want ants in my water. Another monk goes up and sees the ant going to get a drink of water and says, oh, it's okay. All right, the ant just wants some water. I'm not going to mess with it. I'll just let it get its water. It's not going to ruin things. But then the third monk comes up and says, wow, there's a thirsty ant. I'm going to give it a little bit of sugar, too. We need to be more like the third monk. If we have a complete understanding of the past, we can better understand the problems of today and overcome them through compassion and sympathy. Some will say that I am betraying my ancestors by airing the family's dirty laundry. And Steve, who's from Marlin, and I were just talking about how there's at least one member of the Falls County Historical Society that considers me to be the devil. And I still haven't done a book reading in Marlin, Texas. But as an African American told me, it's the only way laundry gets clean is to air it out. And I would take it a step further. When we fail to betray our dead ancestors, we are actually betraying the next generation, because we're not teaching them about the mistakes our ancestors made or the mistakes that we made. Because when we hide our history, that's when we doom our children to repeat it. So that is why I wrote Tomlinson Hill. And that's why I think it's important to embrace the entirety of our history, not just the glorious parts. And while it's painful, and I can tell you some members of my family were deeply pained by the revelations about my ancestors, particularly my grandfather, he died in 1973, but was an active Klan member. It gets down to my journalist's instinct, which is to find the truth and testify and hope that your readers, my readers, will take the lesson and do something good with it. Thank you very much.
And now we'll take some questions. Raise your hands high.
My name is Hamilton Richards, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
When you were in Iraq, did you witness the kind of in-group bonding among American troops, black and white, and between Americans who worked with Iraqi translators? I've heard some stories about real bonding taking place.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And as a soldier, I can tell you, when I was 17 in basic training, that any sense of classism or any differences between our platoon went away very quickly when being screamed at by our drill sergeant, and that was the whole part of team building, and the whole part of basic training is to teach you to come together as a team to accomplish a common task, and that's why I think the military has been one of the leading institutions in terms of fighting segregation in this country. And yes, and not just with translators, but with all of the Iraqis who worked with American troops, and there were a lot of them. There were strong bonds, there were even strong bonds between journalists and soldiers, who would expect that? So yes, there's that common experience is critical. And that's why when outsiders come in and tell you, oh, well, you can't have this bond because you're black or you're white or you're an Arab or you're an American or you're a Muslim or you're a Christian. I mean, that's societal forces that we have to fight, because the individuals, it's very easy for those bonds to be formed.
Hi, thank you for being here. I loved what you were talking to us about with the in-group bonding. But what I've noticed, I was in high school and I remember hating the other teams, the players or whatever. How then do we take those bonds outward? And so it's not just these groups of people like each other because they're working together. How do we create it larger and larger so that we don't find someone else to hate? That to me is kind of this bigger question of moving from the amygdala into the frontal cortex and consciousness. And we could find Americans hating Russians, but then Russians and Americans start working together, but we wind up hating someone.
Right, and I think the critical part of that is to basically teach people how this process works, how this brain process works. One of the interesting things is, and I can geek out on you with this research, it's amazing work. One of the other things they found in testing racists versus non-racists was the level of activity in the neocortex. And it got to the point that on a scale of extreme racism to zero racism, there are many gradations. And what they saw was a steady movement of activity from the amygdala to the neocortex to the point where when people saw images, all that fired was the neocortex, the amygdala remained quiet. And that was because those people were taught not to judge based on appearances. So we can teach people not to overcome that fight or flight mechanism. And I also think it's telling that the people who are deeply racist had almost zero neocortex activity.
Thank you for your presentation today. You still hear today language very similar to what you were describing to justify racism being used to discriminate against gay people. Do you see what are the parallels and differences you see between the current issues and struggles towards gay rights versus struggles for civil rights?
Oh, absolutely. And and that's kind of a one of the things that I didn't get into in the talk this morning was truth and reconciliation, and how in this country we're not really good at truth and reconciliation. Like in South Africa at the end of apartheid, everyone came out and they testified, and everyone got to tell their story, and everyone got an equal hearing, and all the records opened up. And now it's a part of the educational system. We haven't done that here. We have not had an honest assessment of our past, because I was consider myself fairly well educated, and there are aspects of our history in Tomlinson Hill that were just shocking to me, because we don't understand it. But one of the themes of my book is which side are you going to be on? My grandfather had a choice of whether or not to join the Klan. His life didn't depend on it. 60% of the white people in Dallas, 60% of the white men in Dallas in 1924 were members of the Klan. They had a choice. And to say that they didn't know that racism was bad would be wrong, because I read their newspapers. They knew better. This idea that our ancestors didn't know better is also false. We're taught that they didn't know better, but read their newspapers, read the books that were popular, read the political debates, and these debates were all going on. So, yes, there is a parallel in this case where you can ask yourself, which side of gay rights do you want to be on? The same way our ancestors were given a choice of which side of civil rights do you want to be on.
We have a question from Nelson Linder, who is the Executive Director of the Austin NAACP.
Thank you. I want to first of all commend you for writing the book, but I want to sort of challenge your premise. I was born in Macon, Georgia in 1958, and so I started Klan. I understand that kind of racism. We call it overt racism. I understand to think about the mammalian brain and also the cerebral cortex. I think these groups are okay, but I think we're missing the bigger picture. I want to address the bigger picture. This is Austin, Texas, one of the most affluent cities in the United States. You look at things like educational attainment, medium income, unemployment, poverty. We have huge, tremendous gaps, and nobody's addressing that. Let me give you a kind of a concrete example. Just last week, our city council, right now, Austin is on a consent decree federally for not hiring black firefighters. They were found guilty in the federal court. Last week, the white firefighters union got together and told the city council, despite the fact that we're guilty, we want to be back at the table. City council voted 7-0. Ignored the federal government and put these guys back at the table. My point is, we're not addressing the structure of racism in this country. I'm glad that we have groups, but in reality, we're not dealing with the core of it all. When you got governments that see inequity and ignore it, and these are very educated people. They didn't grow up in the South. So I'm saying, why don't we address those kind of issues, the structure of racism, like, for example, the Aspen Institute does. We're not even addressing medium incomes, unemployment, and where governments, like Austin, actually sanction racism. That's my concern. Would you address that, please?
Absolutely, and thank you for coming, Nelson. You know, the original version of my book was 780 pages. I got it down to 430, and I had 35 minutes to warm things up. I do not disagree with you whatsoever, and the theories about the cerebral cortex and the in-group model and education and desegregation, that's the hopeful side. And frankly, we can go into the deeply horrible side as well. So I try to end my talks on an upbeat. But if you were to read my book, it is about structural racism. It is about two families who come from bankruptcy. My family was bankrupted at the end of slavery. Side by side, living on the same plot of land. The only difference between them was their skin color, and how my family was able to regain wealth and maintain the plantation and employ sharecroppers and systematically prevent African Americans from achieving anything close to educational or economic or political equality. And that legacy still is here today in the structural racism that you're talking about. And that's the biggest purpose of my book, is to show, not tell, not lecture anybody and say, oh, there's something called structural racism. No, here it is. Here's how my father was able to go to Texas A&M in 1960 and not have to compete against a single brown or black person for entrance into that university. You know, here is how my white skin allows me to go into a fancy restaurant in ripped up jeans and no one gives it a second thought. But if you're a black man and want to go into the same restaurant, you damn well better have a $1,000 suit on, because people will assume that you don't belong there if you don't. We still part of our biology is to look at someone's appearance and draw conclusions about it. And sometimes those conclusions are correct, but most of the time they're not. I write about something called microaggressions in my book, about how we as the dominant society send these subtle, nonverbal messages that make people of other races or other religions feel uncomfortable. And we exhibit our dominance in that way. One of the biggest things, frankly, I've had to deal with is I had some really bad experiences in the Middle East. And I caught myself becoming, prejudiced against people from the Middle East. And it was based on real experiences, and I had to catch myself and say, you know what? There's something subconscious going on here that I've got to stop, because it's not healthy and it's not right. So, yes, we each and every one of us has to look into our own hearts and think about, what is it that we do? What signals do we send? What prejudices do we carry with us? Because we all do. And we also have to hold our leaders accountable. So when our leaders do things that are racist, that are discriminatory, that fail to address the structural problems that my ancestors helped create to maintain power and privilege, what are we going to do about that? And also, and this is the other part of my book that was really hard, that people have difficulty with, is that my dad dropped out of A&M. I come from a very poor family. I grew up in a mostly black neighborhood on the south side of Dallas. I do not come from wealth, but it sure was easy for me to get ahead once I got out of the Army, because I had white skin. I have to think about my privileges and what power it gives me. I talk about in Africa how I could walk into a room and every black person in the room would get up to give me their chair, because my face my skin tone gave me authority that I did not deserve or was not due to me. So this happens to us still today, and we have to address those things. We have to address it personally. We have to address it politically. It's easy to be ignorant. I mean, when you are the dominant race and you have power and privilege and it doesn't impact you, it's easy to ignore it until there are people in the streets. I'm sorry. Thank you for coming, Nelson.
We have a question here. Would you say your name, please?
My name is Gordon Krupa, and it's really not so much a culture question. You started touching on it at the end there. In structural racism, there's a theory of the dominator culture, and that's in that theory is like there's always going to be an underclass. There's always going to be the people at the top feel it's okay to take advantage of somebody else. It's part of our economic structure. So there's always going to be an underclass, whether it's black, whether it's gay, whatever the current underprivileged people are. The idea, the idea, I mean, if you thought about it this way, is the idea that we think it's okay to take advantage of somebody else. That's where this all comes from. It's like, it's not okay. Do you feel it's okay for the ruling class to take advantage of whatever the underprivileged class is?
Thank you.
I mean, that's not wrong. I mean, that's the difference between, in American definitions, the difference between conservatism and liberalism is liberalism focuses on everyone having being within a certain narrow band of equality, and conservatism assumes that there will always be an underclass. Yeah, that's classical political theory.
We have a question here. Would you stand and say your name, please?
Gordon Flack, and I'm curious, a little different tack. Did the Civil War actually start the Ku Klux Klan? Did it perpetuate the evilness of racism even worse than if it was going to play out?
Well, I mean, the Klan has existed in many different forms, and there's not a clear thread that connects all of the different eras of the Klan. The very earliest Klansmen were Confederate veterans who formed militias and gangs of thugs, basically, to maintain white dominance and oppress black people. The whole idea of the pointy hat and the cape and all of that was, an invention of a man from Georgia who I write about in the book, who was fascinated with, fraternal societies, and so he wanted to start his own fraternal society and based it on the Klan. And Birth of a Nation was created from a novel, and it's all myth. I mean, all that history is pretty much made up, but the Klansmen have embraced it and used it. And the Klan of today is different from the Klan of the 20s. But yeah, I mean, the common theme is actually it's Christian fundamentalism and Christian conservatism with a strong dose of racism. But the Klan's fundamental philosophy is a Christian neo-fundamentalist movement.
I'll briefly editorialize. I don't usually do this, but it's interesting to me that it seems like many members of the current Klan or racist groups are economically marginal and having difficulty functioning in the modern world themselves.
Well, yeah, and that's my observation. I went to a neo-Nazi rally in Tyler 2 days after President Obama won election, and it was theater. I mean, we had there were like 20 people who showed up from the Nazi side. About 200 drove in from Dallas on the anti-racism side. And both sides made as much noise as they could for 2 hours until the Texas Rangers told them to go home. And there were two things that struck me. Is one, it wasn't the guys dressed up in the Nazi uniforms that frightened me as much as the young, burly white men in Carhartt jackets who were watching, who, when we approached them as journalists and said, why are you here? They said, well, we just wanted to see what the neo-Nazis had to say and see if there was anything legitimate to it. I mean, those are the guys who are going to lynch someone, not the guys in the black uniforms with the swastikas on their arms. I mean, to me, it was like some twisted Renaissance fair. Forgive me, anyone who's a big Renfest fan. But yeah, it was. These were people who were marginalized on so many different levels, and this was some sort of sick club they had created and joined. The Aryan Nation's prison gangs are the real people to be afraid of, and they don't hold rallies. They just don't hold rallies. They murder people.
We have a question here from Tom Justice. Tom?
Yes, I can feel a little better or worse about myself. What's this generation in terms of age parameters that you speak about, the one that's doing better?
It's millennials, people born after 1990. 1990?
We have a question here. Would you stand and say your name?
Hi, Maria Person. Thanks for a great talk. I think one of the reasons it's so uncomfortable to go down this road is because one of the places it leads to is reparations, talking about making some kind of amends, which is a scary place to go when you think that you might be on the end of losing stuff. So what's your thought on that topic?
Well, Ta-Nehisi Coates at The Atlantic has probably the most brilliant piece on reparations that's out there today. So if you haven't read it and you're interested, go to the Atlantic website. And, reparations, there's people want to think that we're going to go give every black person a check that is the equivalent of 40 acres and a mule by 1865 prices. I don't know what that means. And that's not what anybody's talking about. Equal opportunity, affirmative action, health insurance. I mean, there are government programs that have been reparations by other names that have never, ever delivered on their promise. And they have been under attack since they were introduced. They're all but dead now, and they need to come back because, and what I find fascinating is that at the Republican convention in Iowa a couple of weeks ago, almost every Republican wannabe candidate for president talked about how we must address income inequality. We must address economic inequality. Well, guess what, guys? I mean, there's a racial component to that, and are you ready to be honest about it? Because the thing is, go to Marlin High School for one day, and it will be one of the most depressing things you've ever seen. And it'll make you love whatever the AISD is doing, believe me.
We have 5 minutes left. We have a question here. Would you say your name?
Sure. My name's Chris Barton, and my question is, I was wondering if you could talk some about the range of reactions you got from members of the Tomlinson family who descended from slaves when you approached them about this project.
Well, it was fascinating because I had second cousins who lived on Tomlinson Hill and owned it, actually continued to own it and plant on it until 1985. LaDanian's grandfather worked for the White Tomlinsons until 1974 when he died. And that was a man named Vincent, an absolutely amazing citizen. He's one of the heroes of the book. So Vincent's kids knew White Tomlinsons. LaDanian's mom knew a White Tomlinson. And so I talk about walking up to to LaDanian's mom. She was the first one I met. And for her to meet a White Tomlinson was perfectly natural. I was scared out of my mind. Because I knew that my ancestors had done bad things to the descendants of the slaves, and I expected to be told off. And instead, the older folks welcomed me. And they kept saying, "Oh, your ancestors didn't know any better," And then they told me that the happy stories about how our families got along so well. And then, I would do oral histories. And I always tell people, if you're going to get an older person to tell you their family history, The first hour is going to be all about how great everything was and everyone was happy. In the second hour, they'll tell you, oh, well, maybe there's a little something wrong. The third hour, they'll start telling you a little bit of dirt about distant relatives. And around the fourth hour is when they say to you, you want the truth? You can't handle the truth. And that's when the good stuff comes out. I had to build trust. It took me 4 years to get the younger Tomlinsons, the Tomlinsons my age, to trust me enough to tell me their stories. And it was only because I was being honest about my family's history, and they realized that I wasn't going to whitewash the story of our families. It was hard. It was hard. And I think we've got just a couple of minutes left.
I was going to ask you, are you working on any current projects similar to your Tomlinson Hill book? Are you continuing this type of work?
Well, I have started a series. I'm a business columnist for the Houston Chronicle. So I have started a series of columns about economic inequality and racial inequality and the role of the business community and the role of economics in sustaining that inequality. The Greater Houston Partnership, the Chamber of Commerce there, has made a pledge to fight this inequality, and I'm going to hold their feet to it. As far as a book project, I came across a Union officer in my research who had commanded black troops in battle and who volunteered to be a Freedmen's Bureau agent in Tyler, Texas between 1867 and 1870. And when he had a lot of troops, he chased the Klan. When Congress pulled his troops out, the Klan chased him. He fought the Clive Barker gang and was wounded 4 times, including in a shootout in the county courthouse, defending the honor of a black woman that had been assaulted by a white man. And that's the kind of person that we call carpetbaggers. And so I kind of want to think about writing about him to say those carpetbaggers were America's first defenders of civil rights.
Terminology is so important, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for your talk and your important social justice work. And I hope your column also is syndicated widely. And again, all the best. Thank you for sharing time with us today.
Thank you.